James Brown walked into a small general store on the outskirts of Barnwell, South Carolina, on a September afternoon in 1958, looking for nothing in particular, just shelter from a rainstorm that had come up fast on the highway and soaked him through his jacket and shirt before he could get back to the car. He pushed open the door, which had a small bell on it that rang once and then was quiet, and stepped inside. He shook the rain from his jacket, pulled the door closed behind him against the wind, and stopped moving. He stood just inside the threshold for a moment and looked at the room in front of him and didn't say anything and didn't move toward the counter and didn't pick up anything from the nearest shelf. He just looked, and something about the particular combination of what he was seeing and what he was smelling made the threshold feel like more than a physical one, like a boundary between the present moment and something that had no clean address in time. The store was small and dim, and smelled like sawdust and tobacco and something sweet and slightly chemical that turned out, when he finally placed it, to be the particular smell of old candy kept in glass jars on a wooden counter. The floor was unpainted pine boards that had been swept so many times they had gone smooth and pale at the center of the walking paths, and stayed dark and grainy at the edges near the shelves. The shelves themselves were wooden, not metal, the kind that had been built into the walls rather than purchased for the supplier, and they held a collection of things that suggested the store had been operating long enough to accumulate rather than organize. Canned goods, bolts of fabric, seed packets, fishing line and hooks in a glass-topped case, 2 pairs of work boots hanging from a nail, a display of Mihai sodas in a rusting red cooler that was probably not the original cooler for the store, but looked like it might have been the cooler that replaced the original, which meant it was still old enough to have its own history and its own particular collection of dents and faded labels. Behind the long wooden counter, a woman in her 60s with white hair and a flour sack apron that had been washed so many times it had gone soft, was doing something with a ledger, but she didn't immediately stop doing when Brown came in, which told him she was accustomed to people taking a moment to get themselves settled before they needed anything from her. Brown was 25 years old in September 1958. He had been on the road for most of the past 3 years with the Famous Flames, playing clubs and ballrooms and sometimes tent venues on the Chitlin circuit across the South and up the East Coast and back again. An existence so relentlessly in motion that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand still in a room that wasn't going anywhere. He had a single getting radio play, Try Me, which would become his first national hit in December of that year, though he didn't know that yet. He was still James Brown of the Famous Flames, known intensely to people who love soul music and essentially unknown to everyone else. A young man who was very good at what he did and who had not yet become famous for being very good at it. He was somewhere between Barnwell and Augusta, driving back from a show, when the storm hit. Augusta was where he had grown up, or at least where he had grown up after a certain age, after the years in Barnwell and the time with his Aunt Honey, after the childhood that had been less a childhood than a series of difficult arrangements made by and for the adults in his life, while James simply tried to find enough to eat and enough warmth and enough of some basic assurance that someone knew where he was and cared whether he made it through the night. Standing in that small general store, watching the rain on the windows, he was not thinking about any of this explicitly. But the smell was doing something to the inside of his chest that had nothing to do with thought. It was the smell of a specific kind of building at a specific moment of his past, the kind of building that existed at the edge of southern towns in the 1940s, where a child could sometimes find warmth without having to explain himself, where the person behind the counter might give you a piece of hard candy without requiring you to account for where your parents were or why you looked the way you looked, which was usually cold and hungry and uncertain. He walked to the counter slowly, looking at everything on the shelves as he went. He looked at a row of Chase and Sanborn coffee tins, The big ones with the orange and red label, arranged in a precise line by someone who cared about arrangement. He looked at a rack of seed packets that said Burpee on them, the kind with the illustration of the vegetable on the front, in colors that were more vivid than any actual vegetable ever was. He looked at a glass jar filled with peppermint sticks, red and white and dusty looking, even though they were probably fresh enough, and he stopped walking. He had not thought about peppermint sticks in years, possibly in a decade. He had been 9 years old, maybe 10 on the day he was remembering, though the memory didn't come with a clear date attached to it, just a quality of light and cold and a specific sensation of standing somewhere he wasn't sure he was allowed to be standing, and wanting something he wasn't sure he was allowed to want. He had been in a store that was probably not this store, but that was built along the same lines, the same pine floor and wood shelves and glass jar candy, and one person behind the counter who could go either way about a hungry kid with no money and no apparent reason for being there. He had been cold. He had been hungry in the ordinary chronic way that was his baseline in those years, rather than a specific emergency. The kind of hunger that doesn't panic you, because you've had it long enough to know it isn't going to kill you today, even if it makes everything else harder. He had stood in front of a jar of peppermint sticks for what felt like a long time, without touching the glass and without asking, just looking at them with the specific longing of a child who has learned that wanting something and having it are two different things that don't always connect. And then, the person behind the counter, a man at that time, a white-haired man in suspenders, with reading glasses pushed down his nose, had said without looking up from what he was doing, "You can have one of those." Brown had not moved immediately. He had stood very still and waited the necessary seconds to understand whether it was a test or a trick or a kindness. Then he had understood it was just a kindness, given without ceremony or expectation, and that was its own kind of lesson. He had opened the jar carefully, the way you open something borrowed, and taken one peppermint stick and put the lid back on exactly the way he had found it, and said thank you, and meant it in a way that was much bigger than the candy itself. Bigger than anything the man behind the counter could have understood he was giving when he said, "You can have one of those." A woman behind the ledger in the Barnwell store looked up now and saw him standing in front of the glass jar, and read something in his stillness that told her he wasn't quite back from wherever he'd gone. "Help you with something?" she said. Brown looked at her. "How much are these?" She looked at the jar. "Penny." He put a dollar bill on the counter. He said, "I'll take one. Keep the change." She started to say something about change, but he had already turned and was walking back toward the window to watch the rain, peppermint stick in hand, and she read something in his posture that suggested she should let the conversation be done. He stood at the window for a long time. What James Brown was doing at that window was not something he would have described to anyone in those terms. Not then, maybe not ever. But it was something that people who knew him well, who had traveled with him long enough to learn his different registers of silence, had come to recognize as a specific state that was different from his other silences. He had several. There was the concentrated silence of the performer running material in his head before a show, the silence that had a tight, coiled quality to it, like a watch wound too far. There was the dangerous silence that came after a mistake in performance, or a musician who played something the wrong way. The silence before the correction that everyone in the room learned to fear. And then there was this kind, which was looser and deeper, and came over him only occasionally when something in the external world happened to match the frequency of something he had been carrying inside without having a name for it. He was one of the most physically expressive human beings alive. A man whose relationship to his own body was so intimate and so precise that he could convey more in a single held note or a single shift of weight than most people could convey in a paragraph of spoken words. But the things that went deepest into him or the things that went quiet first. He was thinking about what it meant to be exactly here in this moment, 25 years old and dry and warm, and holding a peppermint stick he had paid $1 for without thinking twice about the dollar. In a store that smelled like his childhood, on the way back from a show where 500 people had screamed his name loud enough that he could still feel it in his chest, even here, 100 miles away. He was thinking about the child who had stood in a store like this one and waited very carefully and very still to understand whether the offer of a peppermint stick was actually what it appeared to be, or whether there was something else required that he hadn't been told about. He was thinking about the distance between that child and this moment, which was not the kind of clean, triumphant distance that made for a simple story, but something more complicated than that. He had not had the kind of childhood that made for a good story told simply, with a clear arc and recognizable emotional beats that audiences could follow without friction. His mother had left when he was 4 years old, a departure so complete and so unexplained to the child who was left behind, that he had spent years with a gap in his understanding of himself, where that explanation should have been. A gap he had eventually stopped waiting to fill, and had simply built around, the way a tree grows around a wound in its trunk, rather than waiting for the wound to heal before it grows. His father had eventually taken him to live with an aunt in Augusta, a woman named Honey who ran a boarding house out of her home and who was kind to him in the specific way of people who are extending genuine care from reserves that were never meant to sustain an additional child. People who do the best they can with what they have and hope that the best they can do is enough. He had shined shoes outside a radio station in Augusta. He had watched the musicians come and go through the side door with their cases and their instruments and their ease. He had watched, he had listened with the specific concentration of someone who understands that attention itself is a form of practice, that you can learn a great deal about a thing by watching people who do it well before you ever attempt it yourself. He had absorbed everything available from that position on the sidewalk with the shoe-shining box. He had understood, before anyone told him this formally or in so many words, that music was a door that could be opened from this side of things as well as from the other side. That the people who made the sounds that came out of that radio station were not fundamentally different kinds of humans than the ones who shined their shoes on the sidewalk outside it. That the difference was skill and ambition, and the willingness to do whatever work was required to become the person who made the sounds, rather than the person who listened to them from outside. He had done the work, he was still doing it. The rain was lightning against the window. He could see the road beginning to dry at the edges, the way it always dried from the outside in, the center staying wet longest. He thought about Aunt Honey's house. He thought about the radio station. He thought about the church in Augusta where he had first understood, at some age too young to have the vocabulary for it, but old enough to feel it in his body as an undeniable physical fact, what a voice could do to a room full of people when it was fully committed to what it was doing. What it meant to have an entire congregation moving with you, breathing when you breathed, leaning in when you leaned in, the collective animal of an audience in communion with what was coming from the front of the room. He had understood that day that this was not a trick or an accident. It was something that could be done intentionally, that required skill and commitment and an understanding of people that you built one experience at a time. He thought about the reformatory, where he had gone at age 15 for breaking into cars, where he had started a gospel group and discovered that even in that place, even under those circumstances, music could change the quality of the air in a room for everyone in it, including himself. That it could do something to the feeling of being trapped that wasn't the same as being free, but was a kind of dignity that nothing else available in that situation could provide. He thought about Bobby Bird finding him in the reformatory, seeing him perform, understanding something about what Brown was capable of before Brown himself had fully formed language for it, and bringing him into the band on the strength of that understanding. He thought about what it had felt like to be seen and chosen, rather than processed and redirected. To have someone say, not, "What do we do with you?" but "Come with me." He thought about the famous flames, and the years on the road, and all the versions of this same situation he had been in, across the South, cold or wet or tired, in some small town where nobody knew who he was or cared whether he was comfortable. He finished the peppermint stick. It tasted exactly the way he remembered. He turned back to the room. The woman behind the ledger was watching him with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned over a long life not to ask questions when a question isn't what's needed. "That your car outside?" she said finally. "The Chevrolet?" "Yes, ma'am." "Road should be clear in about 10 minutes, she said. "Storm's moving east." He nodded. He looked at the store one more time, all of it. The coffee tins and the seed packets and the work boots and the knee-high cooler and the glass jar with the peppermint sticks. He was looking at it the way you look at something when you want to keep it, when you're filing it carefully in a part of yourself that doesn't get accessed every day, but that holds things you know you'll need later, in some form you can't quite predict yet. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him in a way that suggested she understood the thank you was bigger than the shelter from the rain or the peppermint stick, that it was addressed to something in the room itself rather than to her specifically, and that she was content to receive it on the room's behalf. He walked back out into the wet September afternoon, stepped carefully off the wooden porch to avoid the puddle that had formed at the bottom of the steps, got into his car, and sat for a moment looking back at the store through the rain-spotted windshield. The woman inside had turned back to her ledger. The bell above the door hadn't rung again. The store was exactly as he had found it, holding whatever it held, saying nothing about who had stopped there briefly on the way to somewhere else. 3 months later, Try Me went to #1 on the R&B charts, and James Brown's name began to mean something to people who had never heard of the famous Flames, people who bought records at stores in cities that didn't have Chitlin Circuit venues. In the decade that followed, he became the hardest working man in show business, a designation he had earned rather than claimed, the Godfather of Soul, a cultural force that would shape American music for the next 60 years and well beyond that. He performed on stages where 50,000 people screamed his name until the sound of it became indistinguishable from the music itself. He built an empire from nothing in a country that had structured most of its systems specifically to make it impossible for a man who started where he started to build anything at all. He fought the music industry and the IRS and the racial mathematics of an America that was not always willing to give him what he had actually earned. He became a legend, and then a myth, and then a kind of permanent standard by which other performers were measured, and almost always found wanting. But on a September afternoon in 1958, with the rain beginning to ease, and the road beginning to clear, and Augusta still an hour away, he stood in a small general store in Barnwell, South Carolina, and ate a peppermint stick that tasted exactly like being 9 years old. And he let himself be fully in that for as long as the storm gave him permission to stand still. If this story, about the places that carry our history in their walls, about the distance between where we started and where we arrived, and about how the smallest things sometimes hold the whole weight of where we came from, move you, share it with someone who has ever stood in a particular room and felt the past come back all at once. Subscribe for more stories about who James Brown was in the quiet moments between the performances, and remember that the fire that lights a stage is almost always built first in darkness.